Almost 15 years ago, the Alchemist made one important decision that changed the trajectory of his career. It's what helped him become a critically acclaimed producer, get a Grammy nomination, and he even had a book written about him. I'm assuming this book is about him because I'm actually illiterate. But what you might be wondering is, what was this big decision that the Alchemist made? Well, let's rewind back in time. The Alchemist often talks about how in the early days, he was just trying to get a name for himself by working on as many albums as he could.
I think I was one of those guys who came in that next generation of producers who was kind of like a nomad. Like, I need to be on as many albums as possible.
Through this, he was able to get his beats into the hands of a lot of the top artists that we all know. But as time went on, Al didn't like what was happening in music. It was starting to feel more and more formulaic. And so he chose to do something different. He made a decision to change his approach to music. He did exactly what the producers he looked up to did.
The ones I looked up to coming up, they all produced whole albums.
So in 2007, way before the many acclaimed collab albums he's put out today, he started with just one. He and Prodigy teamed up to put out Return of the Mac, and this marked the beginning of a huge change. And this album helped the Alchemist develop some really key skills as a producer.
Did it change how you thought about production or making music?
Yeah, there's sections of a song, right? And you put in your magnifying glass and you make each section special.
So today we're going to dissect some of these key beat ideas that the Alchemist used to make this album so special. And you'll even see the beginnings of a lot of the production techniques that he still uses to this day on this project. And as we do this, you can start to pick up on some key beat making ideas that you can use for your beats as well. But before we do, think about hitting like and subscribe. And if you do, one lucky winner could win this pen here. It's blue. It's a big pen. So yeah, you could be the lucky winner. So to enter, just hit like or subscribe. So the first song we'll dissect is the most popular off this album, which is Stuck on You. Now early on, the Alchemist decided to make this a concept album, focusing on creating a blaxploitation sound. So we see a lot of soul and funk samples, which is exactly what this track uses.
The magic of your love overpowers me. It seems.
Now when you break this beat down, it starts off with a very traditional 2000s New York sound. We have the soul sample that's pitched up 5 semitones, giving us that chipmunk soul sound that was so popular at the time.
To you, just like glue. I love it, I swear I do. Ooh, babe, I'm stuck.
But as we get into the verse section, we start to have something that feels a bit different and more aggressive. So here is the main section of the sample that was used for the verse.
Oh, I love you.
And the way the sample is chopped up for the verse section is really interesting. Take a listen. I think this really shows just how important it is to surround your sample with the right sounds and patterns. Just listening to this chopped up sample as it is, it feels hard to really grasp what the idea is for this beat. We have this percussion sound that's really abrasive in the sample, and we have that vocal that's in the sample as well that's just singing one singular note throughout, which could make this beat sound monotone. And so take a look at what the Alchemist does. He builds a consistent drum pattern with his snare and the kick. This helps make the percussion sound in the sample feel less abrasive, since its awkward timing doesn't really sound as prominent and affect the beat as much. And when we take a look at the bass pattern, we see something that's more musical, which will help keep the beat from sounding as monotonous. This just introduces a lot more musicality into the beat. Which we also see once we go back into the hook section, and the Alchemist changes the bass pattern to introduce even more musicality into the beat, helping it sound less repetitive and monotonous. Just a great beat here, and we see some really classic Alchemist ideas that we all know and love. But what I find really interesting about Return of the Mac is that we start to see some really early evolutions of many of the production techniques that the Alchemist uses. A great example of this is for the beat on Stop Fronting.
It's the return of the Mac 11, Mac 10, get off, Hennessy, liquor,
Now with the first beat, we saw a traditional approach to sampling, which is to chop and rearrange a piece of the sample to make it your own. With this beat, however, we start to see the Alchemist use a collage approach to sampling, which is technically more advanced. So here is the main sample that's used. And for the first layer, we have just a single repeating chop from this sample. But again, if he left it here, this beat would probably end up sounding really repetitive. So here's what he does. He finds another piece of the sample from earlier on, and he layers this on top of what we have so far. And this works perfectly because of where he placed it. The drums from both chops align perfectly, making this sound seamless. But that's not all. The Alchemist then grabs yet another sample.
Let the world go through ups and downs. All we have to
And he uses this section. And there's at least two different pieces of this sample that are used. He uses this guitar lick at the end of each bar, and these strings every 4 bars. But it doesn't stop there. We have a third sample that the Alchemist uses. It's that guitar that you heard, which is used at the end of every 4th bar. So when we take all these pieces and put them together, here's what we get. And this collage approach is something that you see in many of the Alchemist modern beats. This is something that I talked about in an earlier video of mine on the Alchemist, which I'll link in the description box below. But there's one other idea that you see on this album that the Alchemist really pioneered, which were beats with weak or non-existent drums. And you can hear this on the beat for Take It to the Top.
show you about power, money and respect. Or either you a coward, broke with no strength. 10 G's out of the
When you listen to the sample, the kick and the snare, which are the main components of a drum loop, just aren't as prominent. The instrumentation is the main focus. Now what the Alchemist could have done is take the sample, minimize how much space it takes up, and then added his own drums into the beat like so. But instead, we have something that's more raw and for the time especially, much more innovative. This beat is basically just the sample as it is, with a bit of boosting to make it sound larger. And for the arrangement, he just uses different pieces from the sample, and that's pretty much it. We also have that later part of the beat where that famous Ironside sample comes in. And that's pretty much it. This beat is just really raw, which is something we started to see more of from the Alchemist as time went on. So you can see, working with Prodigy on this album was a real turning point, a huge pivot in the Alchemist's career. But it's exactly what helped him have as much longevity as he's had and made him the producer that he is today. Just an awesome album if you haven't heard it. Now, if you're a fan of the Alchemist, I do have another video on the many beat making techniques that he uses. So if you want to learn some more in-depth tips, check that video out. Otherwise, hit like and subscribe, and congrats to whoever wins the pen. So I'll see you next week. But yeah, watch this video.